recognized.
I want to thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I want to thank my friend. And I want to stress, while we disagree on this, I appreciate his efforts in Native American issues. He has a record that I think is an excellent record overall. We just disagree very profoundly in this case. I will say this: if you happen to just casually turn on the coverage of the debate at any point, you might wonder what we were debating about, because in the course of the debate we've talked about CHIP, we've talked about the Dreamers, we've talked about the budget, we've talked about FISA. We've spent a lot of time talking about a lot of different things other than information hands, and I don't begrudge that to my friend. He feels very passionately about those areas. It is interesting to me on the FISA thing, for instance. We will actually have a debate tomorrow. The amendment that my friend supports will be in order tomorrow. We'll have an opportunity to do that. I think there are good faith efforts underway on both sides on the DACA issue and on the issue of FISA, and particularly on the issue of the budget as well. So again, I wish this place worked a little differently. Sometimes deadlines are like alarm clocks around here, but those things are underway. But what we're talking about today is also an effort that's been waged by Indian nations for over a dozen years to try and reclaim part of their sovereignty that was unjustly taken away from them. I'm going to disagree with my friend very profoundly. Nobody's rights have been taken away. Every American's rights are guaranteed by the Constitution of the United States. The Indian Civil Rights Act of 1965 makes it abundantly clear no tribe can do anything in contravention and restrict the rights of Americans. The only people that have lost rights in this whole discussion and episode have been tribal governments, who had their right to regulate their labor affairs the same way we allow states and localities to do it, taken away from them. It wasn't taken away from them by an act of this Congress. We never passed legislation. It wasn't taken away from them because the administration in power at the time ordered some agency of the executive branch to do something. It was taken away because acting in a rogue manner, the National Labor Relations Board on its own decided it would expand its legal authority. Well, that's great. They may have a case to make, but that's not what they're supposed to do. They're supposed to operate within the authority that Congress gives them. And if they think they need a grant of additional authority, then they come to Congress and ask for that grant of additional authority. They don't simply on their own decide they will willy-nilly violate the rights of a sovereign Native American nation. And that's exactly what happened in this case. And frankly, the tribes have been extraordinarily patient in pursuing the remedy to this. So I think we ought to today take the opportunity to rectify a wrong that an agency of the executive branch did without the consent of Congress, or even without the consent of the President of the United States at the time, and allowed tribes to reclaim the authority that they exercised for over 70 years. If we think we need to do something different in that regard, that's a fair point to make. And if we do, it needs to be the same for state governments and local governments. You don't single tribes out as sovereign entities and impose something on them that doesn't apply to everybody else that's a subordinate sovereignty of the United States, or sovereign of the United States of America. Mr. Speaker, in closing, I want to encourage all members to support the rule, but I recognize my friends probably will not, and that's fair enough. That's a normal partisan debate. But with S-140, the House is taking steps to strengthen tribal sovereignty. This body actually has a pretty good record. I worked with my friends across the aisle when we passed the Violence Against Women Act, which had a very important component, giving tribes back some of the jurisdiction that they needed to regulate domestic abuse and sexual assault on their own territory. And my friends were overwhelmingly supportive and helpful in that measure. Would not have happened without them. And so I know in many cases we do agree. But in this case, under this bill, tribal governments will be able to be excluded from the requirements for employers under the NLRA, just like state and local governments. This legislation will reverse the bureaucratic overreach of the NLRB and clarify the law once and for all. This bill is a common-sense solution that will clarify the original intent of Congress and the NLRA does not have jurisdiction over tribal governments. I applaud my colleagues on both sides of their aisle for this work. We'll actually have a split decision over this. Certainly be some Republicans supporting my friend's position, but by and large, I think this House will do what it did the last time it considered this legislation, that is, on a bipartisan basis, pass it along. This time, given the action of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee, we have every reason to believe the legislation will be picked up and sent to the President's desk, where I'm confident it will be signed. So with that, Mr. Speaker, I yield back the balance of my time.